cities, and mine and my family's second home for the last 14 years. I see many familiar faces, and it fills me with pride and gratitude that so many people keep coming back to this event year after year. Back in 2015, Rabbi Zalman had an idea that he wanted to engage with local attorneys to discuss law, both from a secular standpoint and from a Jewish perspective. And we did our first event in January of 2016. We had some truly tremendous, talented, and well-regarded legal scholars come and speak. And it was successful and enjoyable, and everybody learned a lot. And we found that by looking at current issues, we can trace back a lot of the laws that we're currently following back to the Torah and the original laws that help form civilization in the world as we know it today. And so over the years, we've done a number of topics, and we kind of had to take a break for COVID. But in the interim, we have become an MCLE certified provider. So we will do more events, some smaller, some bigger. This is kind of a nice size. Everybody can sit and chat and, as we say, kibitz, and have l'chaim and some decent food, and say hi to old friends and make new ones. And that's kind of one of the ideas. And the other is to learn. And Rabbi Zalman and I had discussed this topic a while ago, and how we wanted to talk about self-defense from different perspectives, both personal and national, and talk about Jewish law. And I remember asking him, so is there some Jewish law? And he says, oh yeah, there's plenty of law regarding self-defense. The preservation of life is paramount in the Jewish religion and the Jewish culture. So we put this together, and we sent out our first email about it on October 4th. And since then, world events have overtaken us. And we've decided to continue to have this event tonight because we want people to learn. And tonight we will learn a bit about self-defense from both a personal and a national point of view, as well as from a Jewish point of view. And we are really, really fortunate to have two tremendous scholars, practitioners, experienced individuals that are going to help us learn tonight. And the goal is to come away with the knowledge so that people ask you about the event or ask you about what do you think of what's going on. You'll be able to give a little bit of answers. And just to make it easier on you, we put together a very short book with a collection of just a few choice laws. But it is actually in an order to make it kind of interesting to read. There's little tidbits in there we won't even discuss, and they're there for you to read later. And there's some law there. So with that, I'd like to introduce our panelists. And their bios are in the book, and their accomplishments are so great that I just want to be brief about it. Professor Rachel Van Landingham was recommended to us by our friend, Gary Hastings, retired California appellate justice and Superior Court judge, who has helped us on many panels over our years. And when I was talking with Justice Hastings about this topic, he says, oh, I've got someone for you. And he sits on the Board of Trustees at Southwestern, and he says, oh, we have a professor at Southwestern, and she would be perfect. And that's all he had to say. And so Rabbi Zalman reached out, and Professor Van Landingham said yes. And we didn't realize truly how perfect she was for this event. In addition to being a retired lieutenant colonel of the United States Air Force, and military justice in disparate parts of our planet. She is now the Erwin R. Buchalter Professor of Law at Southwestern Law School. And we didn't even know it at the time, because we are the South Bay Jewish Law Association. She lives in the South Bay. She lives right here in Hermosa Beach, down the street. Most people know of that town. It's a lovely town. Thank you for the schlep all the way to here. And even sitting at dinner tonight, I learned more and more about Professor Van Landingham and her accomplishments, one of which is the topic came up of the tunnels in Israel right now. And obviously Israel is on people's minds. And, you know, how many of them there are and what they look like. And she just casually said, well, last time I went to the tunnels, this is what they look like. She has been to Israel, how did you put it, more times than you can count. She, very, very nicely put. She's an expert, and an expert's expert, and she's the person experts come to learn about military law, military justice, rules of engagement, and everything else that you can possibly imagine, and we are very grateful that you're joining us here tonight. Our next guest is Jack Keenan. Jack Keenan comes to us through Drew Josvan, who comes off into our show here. And when we asked Drew, you know, can you recommend someone that kind of knows their stuff, really can do self-defense and on, he says, well, you know, it's funny you should say that, because the person that comes to mind is supposed to be on trial against next week at the time. And Jack Keenan is a public defender for the County of Los Angeles. He has been serving in that office for over 25 years. He is certified to do grade 4 capital. That's the really serious murder cases, and you don't get to that point unless you are trusted, because people's lives are in his hands. He's tried more than 150 cases, more than a dozen murder cases. He's from California, got his master's at San Francisco State, went to law school at Syracuse University in upstate New York, and he's been gracing us here in California, practicing and working hard, and he knows everything. He's been married for 30 years and is a father of 2 children, something you and I have in common. And then lastly, we have Rabbi Zalman. Rabbi Zalman is the chief architect of the South Bay Jewish Law Forum. And actually, this is the first time, even though we do a lot of the behind the scenes, it's the first time we've actually spoken, other than like an introduction. And Judge Kaufman was supposed to give this introduction. He's a little under the weather today. But Rabbi Zalman has been at the JCC here doing adult education. He is the go-to for anything halachic. If anybody has a question about Jewish law, Jewish history, it's an encyclopedia, and it's a pleasure to take a class with him. I've taken many. The first time I ever met him was at a menorah lighting in City Hall in El Segundo, and he came up to me and introduced himself, and I had a baby and a 2-year-old, and he had a baby and a 2-year-old daughters, and he casually just said, by the way, we have a preschool. Sure enough, a couple months later, we had just moved into El Segundo. It was literally our 11th day in town. And we said, all right, I think we should look at a preschool. And we came here, and it's been our home. And I know many of you through this place. And those are our speakers for tonight. We have really highly qualified people. If you could all come on up, we will get started.
So in the late 80s, there was a war between Iran and Iraq. And it was a brutal, bloody, ugly war that lasted many years. And during that time, our Navy deployed ships to the Persian Gulf, and in particular to the Strait of Hormuz, in order to make sure that the shipping lanes, in particular the oil traffic, could get through that vital seaway. During that time, one of the ships was a guided missile cruiser named USS Vincennes, and in July of 1988, they were on patrol, and they knew that their tensions were high, as tensions tend to be, and one one of their helicopters had been launched from the cruise, from the ship, the cruiser, and was being fired at by a couple smaller Iranian vessels, just kind of equivalent kind of PT boats, and they're just shooting guns at the helicopters, not hitting anything, but it increased the tensions. And around that time, at that moment, more or less, there was a signal detected from an aircraft, and they interpreted that signal to be an F-14. Iran had a fleet of F-14s left over from earlier times. And that F-14 was taking off from an airport that had a dual-use airport, civilian and military aircraft. And it started flying well in the direction of the USS Vincennes. And the sailors on board the ship who monitored the safety equipment and the radars and everything said, we may have a problem here. We think there's an F-14 heading right for us. And the captain of the ship says, are you sure? What do you think? And they said it's getting closer and it looks like it's descending. The captain had to make a very swift decision based upon the information he had, where they were, what had been going on, and he said, okay, shoot it down. It turns out that the sailor was mistaken. It was not an F-14. It was an Airbus A320 with 290 passengers on it. It wasn't descending. It was gaining altitude, and they just misinterpreted the radar signals, and tragedy occurred. It was flying to Dubai, and we were wrong. But that was a split-second decision that a captain had to make because of the safety of his crew. Self-defense is easy when we kind of know what's happening, but sometimes you have to make quick decisions. How we're going to explore this evening is we're going to think about different situations and how we interpret them under international, secular, state, federal laws, and Jewish laws. And we're going to ask, when can we use such force? What force are we allowed to use? What action can we take? What are the limitations on that action? What laws govern this? What laws authorize us to use self-defense? And what laws tell us what we cannot do? What are the ramifications? And during the course of this, we're going to also figure out, how are these laws enforced? Because it comes up in different ways depending on local, state, international, and obviously Jewish laws. So with that, Professor Van Landingham, may I call you Rachel?
Please do so.
Okay, that's a little quicker. So
Professor V, and they used to call me Professor V. They still do at school.
Just take it up a little bit or something.
Is that better?
Yes. Yeah. All right. So the captain faced a very difficult decision, difficult time. Was he allowed to exercise the self-defense he believed he was exercising at that time?
And I would put it in a different construct. So I'm going to argue against the construct of self-defense. There, it's international law governing, defense of nationals, defense of American sovereign territory that was manifest in that vessel. It wasn't in domestic U.S. territory. It was in international waters. And under the paradigm of international law, states have agreed amongst each other after the terrible carnage of World War II to not resort to the use of force in their international relations. But there's the self-defense, but the Article 51 right to self-defense of one's nation and one's nationals. But what that comes down to in the context in which you place it of split second, which I'll push back a little bit against that because the commander of that vessel should not have immediately reacted to say shoot it down, because under the laws that govern at the time, they would have to have discerned first using the most reasonable, to the most reasonable degree they could in the time constraint, that was not a civilian aircraft. And so I'd like to place in a little more context, and because that influences the reasonableness of the decision and the legality of the decision to shoot down that civilian aircraft. This was during what was termed it was during the Iraq-Iran War, and there was what was going on called a tanker war, and that the United States was actually protecting neutral shipping vessels, most of them carrying oil, from being attacked by Iran. Iran was trying to provoke the rest of the world, and Iran was trying to diminish Iraq's ability to sell oil on the market. But under the law of the sea, they're not allowed to attack neutral vessels, which they were doing. So the United States was helping protect those vessels, did not make it a party to the war, technically. But the United States Navy had already suffered. We had already lost naval personnel on a ship that had already received fire from two missiles, and naval personnel had died on that other ship. So that's the context. So it wasn't just a lovely blue day floating along, and we think we're going to shoot this aircraft out of the sky. So that commander was required through the chain of command to ensure that everything was done that was reasonable to ascertain what that potential threat was. So it turns out that the individuals under his command did reach out to send some kind of warning, to try to reach out and communicate with that plane, but they were doing so on frequencies that plane did not it had access to but didn't have on at the time. And so when it comes down to whether or not in that split second they could shoot the plane down for the few minutes that they actually had, it came down to was it at the end of the day, as so much of what happens in criminal law under self-defense, was it reasonable? Did you have an honest belief that was a threat? That's usually check. But was that belief reasonable? In the context of military force, that reasonableness is contextual, and it's not based on what we now know looking back. It's based on what the commander should have known at the time. What was feasible for a reasonable commander to have done to ascertain the identity of that aircraft? And in that context, most scholars looking back in the United States military looked back and said, mistakes were made, but mistakes happen in war. Mistakes were made because obviously it was a civilian aircraft, but everything that occurred was feasible and reasonable at the time.
All right. Mr. Keenan, may I comment, Jack?
Yes.
Thank you. So, keeping on the concept of aircraft, back in March of this year, 2023, an agitated passenger on a flight from Los Angeles to Boston, aboard United Airlines, he started screaming, and he arose from his seat, and he grabbed a knife, and he started to stab a flight attendant, actually striking her 3 times in the neck, and then went to the emergency door and tried to open a handle mid-flight at about 30,000 feet. Bunch of passengers and flight personnel jumped on him. Apparently he was quite strong and put up quite a fight. And they were able to subdue him. So that's obviously self-defense.
Or defense of others.
And defense of others. The question I have becomes, again, a question of when. When, at what point, are we really allowed to exercise defense of ourselves and defense of those around us? Must we wait until he's gotten up from his seat, he's grabbed a weapon, he's got his handle on a door, and interpreting the reasonable standard, at what point do you think it becomes reasonable? There is a point where he does say, all of you are going to die. And that kind of gives you a little hint as to how he's feeling that day. But when we explore self-defense and the reasonableness standard, I keep coming back to when. When in the course of these events is it time? Are we allowed to exercise self-defense?
Okay, so we'll assume that when he says you're all going to die, he's crossed that blue line. So he's crossed that blue line when he says you're all going to die. So we go before that. And I'll talk from a state perspective because I don't know federal law. I don't practice federal law. Just show of hands, who here does criminal law?
We can't hear you.
Who does criminal law here? Okay, so very few of you do criminal law. Yes. Okay, so none of you have tried criminal law cases where self-defense has been the issue. So I'll tell you, with self-defense in California, you are allowed to use that amount of force that a reasonable person in a similar situation would feel necessary to use. And there's two key components to that. They're both reasonable. The reasonable amount of force you use and the reasonable person standard. And that standard is both objective and subjective. It says a reasonable person. That can mean any of you. Would you use that same amount of force? But it's subjective to the extent that my own personal experiences influence my reasonable person standard. Have I been in a plane before where I've seen people act up? I'll give you the better example. You probably all live in nice neighborhoods with white picket fences. I oftentimes defend clients who carry guns on them because they live in the projects. They live in areas where somebody's going to roll up on them with a gun on any given day. That person's reasonable standard is different than yours. You wouldn't be expected to have a gun on you if you were walking down the street of Redondo, Torrance, Manhattan Beach, or Hermosa. But you would if you were over at Nickerson Garden. You'd have a gun then. Because if you didn't, the phrase is you either get caught with a gun or get caught without a gun. So the reasonable person standard is different depending on the person. So you're on that plane. And I'll give you another example. I was at an In-N-Out the other day, and my wife is there. And we're sitting down waiting for our food. You know, they call the number, you're in those seats. And a homeless man comes in. And he's doing something with his hand. My wife's talking to me, and at one point I said, stop. And she looked at me like, what? I said, I'm watching this. Because he has something. He has something. He's playing with it in his pocket. I don't know what it is. Maybe he's just playing with himself. He may have a knife. Because my experience is most homeless people have knives. They have knives for weapon, for protection. They have knives to open cans. They have knives to open boxes. But my reasonable person standards, I see a homeless person, I almost always expect them to have a knife. So I watched this guy, and had this guy started to pull that hand out, and had I started to think there was a knife, I would have done something. So on the plane, again, maybe I'm sitting there on the plane, and I hear this guy, and I just think he's being silly, and I ignore him. But maybe I'm that person who's been on a plane where I've had a guy strapped down, tied down by an air marshal. My standard's different. Okay, so it depends on your standards. It depends on what you watch on TV. You watch TV, we get inundated with these stories. And I don't know, I've been on planes hundreds of times, and I've never had one of these encounters. I've never been on a plane. The bad passengers, it's always a child. It's a 2-year-old screaming on the plane for 8 hours. It's never an adult. But you see story after story after story. And if that's all you watch, if you watch that in that isolation, you would think our airline system is a nightmare. And that might be your reasonable person standard, that you're afraid when you get on that plane that you're going to have to deal with that. And so you're watching, you're hyper-vigilant, and that's okay. But are you an officer? Are you a firefighter? Or, are you a stewardess who's seen this before? That reasonable person standard changes depending on the individual.
Can I argue with you on that?
Yeah.
So, but there comes a point, because there's something called the Model Penal Code, which was a bunch of judges and lawyers and scholars got together in the 60s, actually I think it started in the 50s, to come together and say, we're going to write new criminal law for the United States to make it better. Much of it's progressive, not all of it, because attempt crimes are definitely easier to convict someone under the Model Penal Code model. But what it does is something that, in my understanding, I haven't looked at all the jurisdictions, because not only do we have all 50, we have the federal jurisdiction, the military jurisdiction, my expertise, and we have territories. The Model Penal Code approach to self-defense says, as long as the person had an honest belief that there was, and this is going to your temporal question, that there was an imminent threat of serious bodily harm or death, they can use deadly force in response. It gets rid of the objective component. No state follows that, because we don't want everyone going around deciding they're afraid of everybody else and then giving them license to shoot each other. So we have to, what I explain to my students is that it's a contextual reasonableness standard. There's still a reasonable objective standard for the use of force in self-defense, whether it's deadly force or non-deadly force. There has to be an honest, good faith, and reasonable belief that the defendant is facing an imminent threat from the person they're about to use force, and that the force they use is proportional. So if it's deadly force, you can use deadly force in response. But if we conflate it so much with, well, this person watches way more TV and they watch a lot of extreme right-wing news when they think the world's an Armageddon, and so they're going to go shoot through their front door in Detroit and kill the 19-year-old girl that's standing on their front porch, which happened several years ago, who had banged on his door at 2:30 in the morning because she just got in a car accident, and he shot her through the front door as she was walking away, shot her in the back of the head and killed her. He's like, well, I was really afraid. That's pure subjective. That's not reasonableness.
That's what we argue.
That's what defense counsel argue. That's not what I posit is the law in the state of California, because I just read my students the jury instruction, Calcrim jury instruction, and it allows for contextual reasonableness, but it doesn't boil everything down to subjectiveness.
No, it absolutely requires a good faith basis. If you don't, yes, but that I think that word reasonable is the key there. And I think that's what we disagree on. I really do think the term reasonable is what I argue to jurors every day when I do trials. Why this guy had a gun, why this person killed a person, that's what we argue. His reasonable person standard. Did he have an objective good faith? I'll give you an example. You get two gang members walking down the street. One starts to lift up his shirt. The other one immediately knows from his reasonable person experience, he knows he has a gun. So what does he do? He pulls out his gun first and fires. I've won those trials. Okay, I've done that trial. I've won those trials. He had an objective, good faith belief that person, based on his reasonable experience, had a gun.
But just because he won the trial doesn't make it the state of the law in California.
I disagree.
Because the government doesn't get to appeal that. But the California criminal law instruction that juries are read are that they are allowed to take into consideration threats made by the victim to the defendant. Not everything else, not all the bad things that happen to the defendant in their entire lifetime. So there is a limit. There is a limit in California jurisprudence. There's a limit in California criminal and jury instructions, which I believe we have some of them here. But I also believe I oppose mass incarceration.
So, if I may interject for a second, we actually have a third panelist, Rabbi Zolman.
Oh, wait, if I can just real quick.
Absolutely.
So there's a second aspect to this. The amount of force you use. The amount of force you use cannot be unreasonable. Now, one thing on this, I think I saw it in the book, you bring a gun to a knife fight. California, you can bring a gun to a knife fight. I come up to you with a knife, you have a gun, you reasonably believe I'm going to do great bodily harm or commit death, you have a right to shoot me even though I had only a knife. You are not required to run away. California has a stand your ground law, like Florida.
Shoot where you're going to protect yourself.
It's the majority of jurisdictions in the United States. They have gotten rid of what used to be called a duty to retreat before you can use deadly force. But it was only a duty to retreat if you could safely do so. But with the proliferation of guns, it's never safe to do so. So the vast majority of states have gotten rid of the duty to retreat. So one can stand their ground and use deadly force even if one can safely retreat.
But I'll give you an example of maybe unreasonable. One of my colleagues has this. A woman commits a hit and run. She drives off. A young man follows, same race. He gets out of his car. She's at a stop sign. He's banging on her window. She pulls a gun and shoots him. That's probably going to be an unreasonable amount of force. There's no evidence that he had a gun or weapon. No evidence that he made threats. In fact, quite the opposite. She's going to undoubtedly say she was in fear for her life, but it's an unreasonable fear and it's an unreasonable use of force. But at the same time, I do have a right to pursue. I can stand my ground. I can pursue the assailant, but I have to use that reasonable amount of force for that situation, and so that becomes the other issue.
All right, and we'll do more on that in a minute. Rabbi Zolman, under Jewish law, we are not just allowed, but almost required to defend ourselves and those around us. I'd like you to talk briefly about that, but first, can you just tell us what it means when we say Jewish law?
Thank you. Is this working?
Yes.
So first, a little bit about Jewish law, which I guess I'm sitting here representing. So the law of the land here is state law, California law, and federal law, right? That's the law of the land. Our Jewish law, though, is ancient. It goes back to when the Torah, which is over 3,000 years old. So it has a long 3,000-year history. In fact, much of our current law is, at least to some extent, some of it is sourced in Jewish law and comes from original Jewish law that then made its way through Christian law, then made its way through our law today. So once upon a time, back when Jews had their own independent state in the land of Israel, the laws, Jewish laws, was of the law of the land. And that would have been both religious laws, rituals, was the law of the land, as well as civil laws, criminal laws, that would have been the law of the land for Jews. Now, over history, we lost our independence, really more than 2,000 years ago. And so for much of our history, we didn't live in independent Jewish lands where we were able to enforce our own laws. And yet, in most places that we lived, we had some level of autonomy, where, while maybe high-level laws we couldn't enforce, maybe laws in our interactions with our non-Jewish neighbors we couldn't enforce, murder, it was often we couldn't enforce, or capital punishment, but on smaller scale things, financial issues, even small-scale criminal issues, we were able to enforce our own laws in many places that we lived over history, and it really varied from place to place. We had our own communities, we could enforce our own laws at will. Now, in modern times, that no longer exists anywhere. In other words, there is no place today in the world that runs on Jewish law, where Jewish law is the law of the land. The land of Israel, they have a secular law that's built mostly on British common law from their time as a mandate. It is somewhat informed by Jewish law and influenced by Jewish law, but Jewish law is not the law of the land. And yet, Jewish law remains very relevant for us today. And it remains relevant for a number of reasons, which is why we have these forums to share this. So, firstly, Jewish law informs much of our law today, or it influences our law. In fact, courts, going all the way up to the Supreme Court, have quoted Jewish law and as the origins of our laws. So understanding Jewish law is important to help us understand at least partially where our laws come from. But it's also, although it may not apply, it cannot be enforced today, Jewish law is still the law that a practicing Jew would want to live by. We believe that it's the Word of God. These are the rules of God. And so it's something that, even if not enforced, we live by, we want to live by. Now, this would be true mostly for civil law, or civil interactions, of course, for ritual law, for things that are just religious law, but it would also be true for the way we interact with each other, not in criminal law, because we don't have any ability to enforce criminal law among ourselves and within our own communities, but at least in the way we interact and in the values that we have. And so we believe that we should attempt to observe the laws as best as we can. Now, there's a caveat here, because we are living we do have overriding state and federal laws. And Jewish law encourages us to follow the laws of the land. And so, except when the law of the land violates our ritual law and some other rare instances, generally we would give the law of the land precedence over our own law. And yet in our own interactions, we try at least to follow our own law. But then on top of that, we live thankfully in a democracy. We live in a democracy where each of us not only have a vote, but we have the ability to influence others. And we have the ability to influence viewpoints and to take our values and our ethics and insert them into the state government, into the federal government, as we feel is correct, as we feel is right. And so, as Jews who believe in the values of Judaism, believe Judaism as divine teachings, and see these values not just as divine, but as just and meaningful. So understanding these laws then should help influence our understanding of today there are a lot of very controversial issues, things that are hotly debated, things that come up all the time where there's the country split, and we can turn to Jewish law and say, well, what do our traditions say about this? What do we have to say about this? So while Jewish law is not enforced today, it can still be observed voluntarily, and we can still choose what we say about this. And that comes back to the most important difference between our current state and federal laws, and as opposed to Jewish law, where state and federal laws, they're laws that were enacted by humans, by our state assembly, by our Congress, by courts over the years, that we may think are right, we may think are wrong, and we all know there's a lot of bad laws on the books. There's a lot of foolish laws. There's a lot of laws that we strongly disagree with. Jewish law, we believe, is divine law. So it's not only laws, but these are values. These are the ideals of the way we think things should be. These are the things that whether our sages from the Torah itself through our sages over the generations, these are values that they held. These are the values of Judaism, the values that are dear to the Jewish people. So we use these laws to help inform how we should live our lives. These are our ideals. They're not just, it says you should go 65 on the freeway, but I like to go 75 and I think it's a bad law. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But we could argue about that. But these are values these are what we believe divine values. And so they're things that if we believe in Jewish law and we believe in its value, then these are things that we want to internalize. In other words, they're meaningful, not just somebody else is telling us that we have to do it.
All right.
So now back to our question with that.
We will give you an opportunity to speak more about self-defense under Jewish law in a moment. But getting back to the concept of when, we started with something that was a spur-of-the-moment crisis that occurred. It occurred on a ship in the Gulf, and it occurred on a plane in the sky. There's also situations where you can contemplate that harm may come, and there's a decision to be made whether or not to engage in what's known as a preemptive strike. So, Jack, I'm going to refer a story to you. Back in 1977, a 29-year-old housewife named Francine Hughes was charged with first-degree murder for killing her husband. He went to sleep, and she set the bed on fire. This may ring a bell. The burning bed was made into a movie. I believe that Farrah Fawcett starred as the defendant, and she claimed in her defense that she was confident that at some point, her husband was going to kill her. That he had been abusive, physically, emotionally, mentally, every which way, and at some point she finally said, I have enough, and engaged what many might say is a preemptive strike, killing him. And maybe he wouldn't have killed her the next day, maybe he wouldn't have killed her for a week, but at some point, Jack, is there a point at which, under our self-defense laws, we can engage in a preemptive strike?
Yes, and California has codified battered women's syndrome both into the evidence code and into the penal code. So battered women's syndrome, which used to not even be presented, now can be presented as evidence. And so we present psychological histories, we present prior bad acts, prior domestic violence acts. We put up witnesses to talk about what this batterer would do. We've had it both with men and women, what they would do to their spouse. I've had this debate with colleagues about when, let's just say, for instance, the wife has a right to act. I have an opinion that there has to be a type of conduct where, in her mind, she sees. I'll give you an example. I'll give you a personal example. Every Friday night, my father would come home, he would drink, and he would beat Mom. We knew it. We knew how it was going to work. We knew when it was going to happen. We knew what he looked like. We knew what he would say. And we knew when it would occur. If my mother today had saw that, she would know in advance that she had a right to defend herself, shoot him, kill him, protect herself. Now, where I think you draw the line is if she's saying to herself, in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month, he might hit me. I think you start drawing a line where it's gone beyond peremptory. There has to be some nexus between his behavior and her legitimately believing, good faith belief, that she is going to be assaulted. And that nexus becomes hard because you do have to show a pattern of conduct, that he does this on a regular basis. He does this at dinner time. He does this when the kids cry. But the argument I've had with colleagues is I don't think she can just simply do this. I'll give you another personal example with a client. She'd been human trafficked for years. She'd been prostituted for years by boyfriends. The current boyfriend had human trafficked her, put her out for prostitution. They had mutual domestic violence incidents between both of them. At some point, she went over to his house, slashed his tires. She came over on another day to slash his tires. The father says, "No, we're not having any of that. Get out of here." She circles around the block looking for him. She runs him over and kills him. They're going to pursue a battered women syndrome on that. I think that one is not going to succeed. I don't think you're going to show the nexus between where she thought she was going to be assaulted and where she had to protect herself and the conduct that she engaged in. Had she said that I knew he was going to come after me after slashing the tires and he was going to beat the hell out of me, maybe. Had there been a pattern of conduct that you could connect, a nexus, yes. But in this case, this was more than peremptory. This was just cold-blooded murder.
And as Rachel has pointed out, the word imminent sometimes plays a role.
I don't think with battered women syndrome it has to be imminent. It has to be imminent in her mind. That he may not beat her that night, but in her mind, she believes that when X happens, Y happens. And she knows when he comes home drunk, I'm getting beat. She knows when he comes home and the children are crying and they're not fed, she gets beat. There has to be that nexus. And, so that's the preemptive. It can't be preemptive like, you know what, he's been doing this for me for years and years and years, and I'm just tired of it, and I'm going to kill him. That's not battered women syndrome.
All right. So, Rachel, different kind of preemptive. On June 7th, 1981, the Israeli Air Force launched a strike against the Iraqi nuclear reactor, and it was the first successful raid conducted against what's considered a hostile nuclear reactor. It was using American F-16 jets, and Israel was legally not required to use them to attack its neighbors unless as an act of legitimate self-defense. The reactor was not really yet operational, although I think it was getting close. But when you're a country surrounded by 400 million enemies, can a country have a battered woman syndrome to the extent that it's appropriate to take a preemptive strike such as they did in 1981?
Not according to customary international law nor the United Nations Charter. President Ronald Reagan roundly and publicly criticized Israel for the Osiris strike in 1981 in a letter to, I believe he sent it to the United Nations. I don't remember where the letter, you can still find the letter. So here's the legal construct. Rachel, personally, hell yeah, do it again, and Israel should do it again, and I fully believe they will do it again if Iran is at that point and they have the intelligence. But what international law says, under what is called the use ad bellum, it's the law governing the use of force on the international stage, primarily demonstrated by or manifested in the United Nations Charter, but also informed and governed by what's called customary international law, which is made by states practice, coupled with states' opinio juris. They believe that they have to engage in these practices because it's the law. So it can get a little fuzzy. It's a lot of job security for lawyers and sometimes determining what is customary international law. But the UN Charter is pretty clear. Article 2.4, do not use force, right, against another state's political independence or its territorial integrity or in any other way inconsistent with the United Nations Charter. You don't get to use force. However, Article 51 says, yes, you can use force because you have an inherent right of self-defense in the case of armed attack. The United States, appropriately, I believe, says any use of force is an armed attack. We don't believe there's a delta between the two. Scholars, folks argue about that, but the United States position is you use force against the United States, we're going to use force to stop it if we see it happening. So it says in the case of armed attack. Today, with nuclear weapons, the vast majority of states, rightly I believe, do not think you have to wait before you have a nuclear bomb detonating in your city, before you can use force in self-defense. So this actual construct, though, when can you use force? Whether you call it anticipatory, preemptive, the words sometimes lose their meaning because different folks use them differently. What the strike has to be, if we're going to call it preemptive, it has to meet 3 criteria that actually go back to Secretary Daniel Webster during a little kerfuffle we had with the Brits, who decided to take one of our ships and just burn it, and then set it adrift and went over the side of Niagara Falls, because that U.S. ship tied up in the U.S. side of the river had been ferrying enterprising Americans, let's call them. They were capitalists, as they should have been, and they were ferrying goods over to an island that was providing goods and services to Canadian rebels, if you will, that were trying to throw off the crown in Canada. The Brits didn't like that, so the Brits, in the middle of the night, came over to the ship that had been making money by selling goods to these Canadian insurgents, if you will, and set it adrift and put it afire and set it adrift. But there was someone still on board, a cabin boy, that wound up dying. The United States was like, you just attacked us, what the heck? And in this letter to the Brits, Secretary Webster said, the need for the use of force must be overwhelming, instant, leaving no moment for deliberation. So out of that exchange comes 3 legal requirements before force can be used in self-defense under the United Nations Charter. The threat must be imminent, not in 2 weeks, not in 3 weeks, but imminent. And the force used has to be necessary, meaning even if there's an imminent force, if there's a other non-force mechanism, such as the United Nations, I know a lot of folks will roll their eyes inappropriately, but the force must be necessary. There was another way, such as in that instance with it was called the Caroline case. The ship was the Caroline. You could have come to us at the State Department and said, get your folks to knock it off and stop supplying these rebels. And then the force must be proportional. This is the first time we're going to use the P word here today, proportional. It means different things in different contexts. In this context, it means Israel, if we're going to go after the Osiris reactor, don't take out any city that's near it too, right? That's not necessary. But where Israel was criticized was primarily on the imminence prong. The threat wasn't imminent, and there were other things that could have been done before the threat became imminent that you hadn't tried. That was the primary. Because the strike was proportional, it fit that, but it didn't fit the other 2 in the eyes of the world. But I'm glad they did it, and I hope they do it again.
Rabbi Zolman, when, under Jewish law, can one exercise self-defense?
Very general. When can one exercise self-defense? So I guess let's go back a little bit. So in Judaism, saving a life is the number one thing. We put a life before anything. We would stop. We would transgress any of the commandments of the Torah in order to save a life. And we believe that a life has infinite value. The Mishnah tells us, and this is in your books, number 2 on page 163, that one who destroys a single soul destroys the entire world. One who saves a single soul saves the entire world. So the life in Judaism has infinite value. And as when we get to perhaps proportionality and the like, we could talk more about valuing one life against another. How do you number lives when they're all infinite? Infinity, you can't. One infinite and 2 infinite are the same mathematically. And so you run into that challenge. But Judaism has another very interesting law. And that is a rule called rodef. Rodef means a pursuer. So while every life has infinite value, so much so that you cannot kill one person to save another person. Because if you kill one person, the Talmud says, who says their blood is any redder than the other person's blood? So you don't have the right to kill one person to save someone else. Not only that, you can't kill one person to save the lives of 1,000 people. Because you run into the same question. Who says their blood is redder than the other 1,000 people? Well, the 1,000 people's blood is redder than that one person. It's all infinite. However, the moment someone is threatening another life, as soon as someone is threatening others and aggressively threatening another life, at that moment they gain the halachic status, or the Jewish legal status, of a rodef, of a pursuer. And at that moment, their life loses its infinite value because of their actions. And therefore, their life can be taken if necessary. And there's a big if necessary here. In other words, if you can stop them in another way without taking their life, you definitely are required to do so. And taking their life would be murder. But if the only way to stop them is to take their life, then you would absolutely be required to, in order to save your own life, in order to save another, not just self-defense, but defense of a third party. If another person was being threatened, if someone's threatening another person, even though usually we would never kill one person to save someone else, the moment they're threatening a person, immediately we're able to kill, not only are we able to, we are required to kill someone to save someone else. And this, well, I guess I'm bringing up another thing, but this leads to another law in Judaism, which the Torah tells us in Leviticus. I think we printed it right at the beginning on page 4. Lo ta'amod al damrei echa. Do not stand by your fellow's blood. So not only are you expected to save your own life and required to save your own life because we're supposed to want to live, but if we see another life in danger, we should do everything we can to save that person who's being threatened, including taking the life of the person who's threatening them. So if someone's threatening them, we should do whatever it takes to take their life. And even if there's 1,000 people chasing one person, we have the right to kill, not only right, obligation to kill those 1,000 people who are currently all pursuers to save the life of that one individual. So that's just a general backgrounder on Judaism and saving a life. Should we get to the state at what point? Or okay.
So on the concept of threats, threats can mean different things to different people and different things to different nations. There's lots of threats. People threaten all the time. We've seen terrible threats just posted online in the last week. But at some point, a threat allows you to do an act to protect oneself, and at other times it's just someone blowing off steam. So, Jack, how do we tell the difference? For example, if, and this is going back to my days as a prosecutor, it reminded me of this story, but 2 people were sitting on a stoop in Brooklyn, young man and his girlfriend, and someone walks by and, let's say, notices the girlfriend and leers a little bit, looks a little long, and keeps going. Well, the threat would be when he says, if you look at my girlfriend like that again, I'm going to beat you senseless. Would that allow that person who's walking by, leering, an opportunity in self-defense?
So California has criminal threats law. We'll start with that. If in criminal threats law, I have to convey a threat, and I have to mean it as a threat. I'm going to kick your ass. I'm going to kill you. I have to convey a threat that I mean for you to hear as a threat. And then you equally have to take it as a threat. You have to have had a legitimate fear, and that fear may be based on the context of the situation, the person I am, whether I'm an ex-spouse, a gang member, somebody who scares you, you know. So, but you have to take it as a threat. I think depending on the situation, do I take that as a threat? If I took that as a threat every night, my wife would be locked up. I don't think that by itself rises to the level of self-defense, because I'm just sitting there. He's not done anything more, right? He's not approached me. He's not pulled out a weapon. He's not walked up and put his fist in my face. He's not touched my girlfriend or laid hands on me. He's just made the comment and walked on. I don't see a good faith basis to believe my life is in danger. I don't see the basis for me to pursue him, to pull out a weapon, to assault him. Again, that situation can change depending on the conduct. Again, in LA, it's not uncommon for that to occur with a homeless person making that threat. And that person may have mental health problems and may seem crazed. I may seem dirty, undressed, scary, for lack of a better phrase, and you may have a very different reaction to that person than I would have it to you saying it to me. So I think it depends on the context, and in that context by itself, I would say no.
Well, so in real life, when I investigated that case, and I interviewed the girlfriend who was sitting on the stoop, what she said happened was the young man had walked by, noticed them on the stoop, looked at her, and the boyfriend was a little upset by this, didn't say anything. And the guy just kept walking, went around the corner, and the boyfriend turned to his girlfriend and said, "I'll be right back." And he walked around the corner, she heard 2 shots, and then he came back. So there was actually not even a threat in that situation. But that's sometimes just the way it is. On a different sort of threat, Rachel, internationally, so there's a war going on in Ukraine right now. And Vladimir Putin in September 2022 made what could be seen as a threat. He stated the following: if the territorial integrity of our country is threatened, we will certainly use all the means at our disposal to protect Russia and our people. This is not a bluff. One other threat, just to think of. There's a deliberative body, a parliament, in a country in the Middle East that all of the parliamentarians got together, and this is on camera, you can see it. It's from October of 2022, and they chanted the following: death to Israel, death to America. They just talking to present a threat that we can use to defend ourselves. Threats, as you put it, maybe in the eye of the beholder, so it has to go both ways. How does it work in the international arena?
It's still that reasonableness standard, because even if that young man sitting on the stoop had the good faith belief, he honestly believed that young man walking by was going to circle back around just because he ogled his girlfriend and actually attacked them, and so he went and killed him. Because that's not reasonable, that's not self-defense. So in these statements, again, there has to be a reasonable belief, reasonable in the eyes of the rest of the world, because international law is one of the major criticisms is its lack of enforcement, right? So there is a lack of enforcement, but vis-a-vis criminal law, but even with criminal law, the vast majority of crimes are never prosecuted in the United States. But we do have more of an enforcement than international law. But under international law, before the use of force can be engaged in, there has to be a threat of armed force being used against that country, and that armed force, that attack has to be imminent, an imminent armed attack. So threatening, I hate to even parse Vladimir Putin's words, and leaves a very bad taste in my mouth. I'm heading to Ukraine in about 3 weeks to provide training for law of war training for train the trainers for members of their military, and I've been there before. But he made it conditional. If you do this, I'll do that. Okay. That's not any sense of an imminent threat in which you need, it's necessary to use force to counter this. That's a very generic threat. And again, the second, as unfortunate as it is, you need more there. I think we're much closer with the Osiris reactor, even though it did show there was substantial amount of time. But the greater the threat, the less time you have to give them. And of course, nuclear weapons would be the greatest threat. So again, there has to be something there. But whether or not the world community is going to enforce any of these standards, that's another question. The Nagorno-Karabakh, a small enclave called Artsakh, that are the Armenian people, one of the oldest enclaves of Christianity in the world, have had Armenians living there for thousands and thousands of years, just got wiped off the face of the earth by Azerbaijan. And the world's like, sorry guys. So again, that there is a lack of enforcement, and that one is a separate question.
If I can ask, what about the ability to protect your citizens over in those foreign countries? If chance kill Americans, kill Israelis.
Yes, the United States does not have to wait for an attack on its sovereign territory, just like with the Vincennes. That's U.S. citizens, and actually vessels are considered U.S. territory, but the United States can go in and use armed force in defense of its nationals in the face, and it doesn't have to wait for them to be attacked, but there has to be an imminent threat, right, that they are about to be attacked, and that the force used is proportional, which is usually the easier one to meet, and that it's necessary to use that force. There isn't another way to stop that imminent threat of force. Again, in those two situations, I didn't hear any other context, any other intelligence data to say there was an imminent threat of armed force besides the empty rhetoric that these individuals spout off over and over and over again. But it's not always empty, as unfortunately we know. But that's what intelligence operatives and intelligence agencies are for.
All right. So you mentioned proportionality. So let's start with the actual rule of proportionality under international law. Which states essentially the rule of proportionality requires that the anticipated incidental loss of human life and damage to civilian objects should not be excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage expected from the destruction of the military objection. That's the rule of proportionality. It's not tit for tat, or, Rabbi, I would turn this question to start with you. It's not an eye for an eye, is it, under Jewish law? What type of force are we allowed to use to protect ourselves, and must it be proportional, an eye for an eye?
So, the tit for tat question, I guess we could start with. And I think over here, when it gets, especially when we move to international law, where you said the enforcement is not very good, I think that's where our Jewish values really come into play, because both as citizens in a democratic country and as, you know, in Israel, which is a Jewish state, though it's secular law, but informed by Jewish values, our Jewish values should really matter, in a sense, even more than international law when it comes to these things. So firstly, a little bit about tit for tat. So for those who quoted the Torah saying an eye for an eye, from the earliest times, it's been clear that we don't believe in retaliation. We do believe in punishing criminals. We did an event over here a couple of years ago just about that, or about the death penalty. We do, but we don't believe in retaliation. We don't believe that, we believe that God punishes, but we don't believe that we humans have the right to get someone back just because they got us, let alone get a nation back just because they got us. And no country should ever retaliate just to get them back. There's no, at least in our ethics, there's no ethical excuse for that whatsoever. What there is, and I think this is a lot more important, is there is a obligation to defend ourselves. And this is that self-defense obligation we spoke about earlier, the value of each life, where every life is infinite, and we have to value it as that, as infinite. So we should look at, so if a life is threatened, we should do everything it takes, including taking a life, in order to save a life. So that's one detail in the importance of doing something. But then when we're talking about on the national state, which I'm imagining your question is about, when we speak on a national level, there's a different issue. And that is the laws of protecting or defending our state. Defending our state, our city, our group, whatever, however we may be defined. It doesn't necessarily, Judaism doesn't necessarily need it to be a nation state, which is somewhat of a modern concept. We've been around for a lot longer than that. But here we move into a whole different thing where we have a societal responsibility to ourselves to protect ourselves and defend ourselves. And so in Judaism we have this very strong requirement for self-defense. Now there are different types of wars. In other words, there are in Judaism what we call Milchemet Reshut, which is a optional war, a war perhaps that we can maybe have other options, and that we no longer do that today, and we haven't done it since back when we had a temple and prophets. And then we have what we call Milchemet Mitzvah, wars of a mitzvah, wars that are obligatory, it's a mitzvah, it's a command to do, because we're defending our sovereignty, we're defending our people. And over here, we go much further than we would in personal self-defense. So while personal self-defense there needs to be a real threat, and we can talk separately about imminent and how real it has to be. There must be an aggressor. When it comes to a nation's defense, we have a requirement as a nation to defend our nation and make sure our nation is defensible. And so anything that harms our sovereignty, or not sovereignty in the modern sense of the term, but our ability to defend ourselves, harms our strategic defense in any way, that itself is enough for us to do something about, to respond to in any way that we can to ensure our strategic defense. There's a rule which maybe we'll get to, it's relevant to some other things as well, but there's a rule mentioned in the Talmud, and this is also quoted in Shulchan Aruch, in the Jewish code of Jewish law, we have it in our books as well, that if there's a town that has invaders that are coming, and there are groups, and this is kind of when states were less organized and defense was more town by town, and there's a group that is coming because they want to steal our straw. They need straw for their animals, and they're kind of invading our town. They don't want to harm us, no harm. We love you guys, we just need straw, we're going to take your straw. And so the rule is that the defenders of the city should defend the city and block their entry and use force, violence, if necessary, killing them, in order to stop them from coming in. And which tells us something about territorial defense, but it also shows us that if something's going to harm our ability to strategically defend ourselves, and having invaders coming in claiming not to want to hurt us, and maybe they really don't, but once they're inside, it's going to be really hard for us to defend ourselves. It's going to harm our strategic defense. The moment it harms our strategic defense, we're allowed to take any action necessary to ensure that we are safe, to ensure that we as a people are safe. So I think this would go back to the reactor question. Maybe Israel, I don't know if Prime Minister Begin at the time was informed by Jewish values or not, or maybe it was just a gut feeling. But the Jewish values would tell us that if someone has a weapon that would significantly harm our ability to defend ourselves, if we allow them to get this, then we can do anything it takes to ensure our strategic defense.
Jack mentioned earlier a quote from Sean Connery of the Untouchables. They pull a knife, you pull a gun. He sends one of yours to the hospital, you send one of his to the morgue. So in the 1950s, there was a town that had two young social groups in it. And they would often meet at night and rumble. The socias on one side and the greasers on the other. And they would have fist fights and they'd punch the hell out of each other, and then they'd go back among their ways. S.E. Hinton wrote about that, for those of you that recall that book. But in one scene in that book, The Outsiders, one of the greasers was being held underwater by one of the socias. And in order to protect the greaser, another greaser named Bob pulled out a knife. And he stabbed the soc to stop the drowning and actually killed him. And not to ruin the book for you or the movie that was made later, it caused a whole lot of problems. In the context of self-defense and proportionality, you mentioned earlier, deadly force, we can use deadly force in a knife and a gun, both deadly. But if it's just fists, can we go that next step? And does it depend on who you are and where you are and what the context is?
Yes. So, I mean, maybe before getting to the question, because again, I've argued this, if you're a much larger man than me, am I supposed to wait until you beat me to the ground and assault you if I have a weapon on me to protect myself? If I think you're about to cause me great bodily injury or death? The law doesn't say I have to do that. If I have a reasonable belief that you're about to cause me great bodily injury or death, I have a right to use that amount of reasonable force necessary to stop that attack. And I don't have to wait until you've hit me. I don't have to wait until you've knocked me to the ground. I can be preemptive in that sense. But in your hypothetical, it's not self-defense, it's defense of others. He sees his friend being and based on the hypothetical, I'm going to say being drowned. And he sees his friend either suffering death or great bodily injury. And if he reasonably believes the only way to stop that individual, and again, it may depend on the nature of the individual. Maybe it's a small individual, he could have just grabbed and pulled off. Maybe he was just pushing his head under the water. But assuming he had a good faith basis belief that his friend was about to suffer great bodily injury or death, he has a right to use that amount of force to stop that attack. And in this case, if pulling a knife was that amount of force necessary, he has that right to use that amount of force. And again, jury's going to decide whether or not that amount of force was reasonable or not. And it changes with the weapon because jurors will look at the different type of weapon, whether it was reasonable or not. But he does have a right to defend others.
Well, you use the term necessary, which is also the same word that is used in the rule of proportionality in international law.
Well, so real quick on that,
Yes.
I don't think so. California, we don't define it as proportionality. It's a reasonable standard. I mean, it's that the proportionality is that amount of force necessary to stop the attack, to stop great bodily injury or death. Proportionality, I don't think really applies in the sense I can use a gun depending on the situation, and you may not have a gun. I can still use a gun depending on the situation. So proportionality doesn't necessarily play a factor. It's reasonableness of the actions.
Well, the courts have actually interpreted it as proportionality being that amount of force. Proportionality is defined in terms of necessity, which is if you're facing a threat of non-deadly force, you don't get to use deadly force in response, because that would, and the term's been used in old common law cases of disproportionality.
In this scenario, we would presume, I'm assuming, deadly force.
But this is, if you see deadly force,
Yes.
and that's where the use self-defense in non-deadly situations has a proportionality requirement, because it's disproportionate to use deadly force in response to non-deadly force. If there's a good faith, reasonable belief that people would believe that that's non-deadly force. Someone walks up to you and slaps you. You don't get to take out a gun or a knife and stab them back. Someone walks up to you and puts a gun in your face and says, I'm going to kill you. Even if it's a fake gun. If you don't know it's a fake gun, you absolutely have every right to take out your gun and shoot them. Because you have a good faith, reasonable belief that you're facing an imminent threat of serious bodily harm or death. But in this situation, he was witnessing what sounded like, was this Pony? I don't remember. My son just finished reading about Pony. He was witnessing, and he thought he had a good faith, reasonable belief that someone else was facing an imminent threat of serious bodily harm or death, which allowed him to use deadly force. Deadly force is serious bodily harm or death to save his friend. So again, there's no proportion. The proportionality is baked into it already.
California actually has two separate self-defense. They have self-defense with regards to murder, but they also have self-defense regarding non-murder cases. So, like she said, somebody comes up and slaps me or spits in my face. Spitting is a battery, but I can't pull out a gun and shoot you. I don't see it as proportionality. I see it as the reasonableness of the action. You can define it either way you want, but you slap me, you spit in my face. A non-deadly action, I don't have a right to escalate that to a deadly action. And the law also talks about it can't be contrived. My fear can't be contrived. I can't just be afraid. I spit in your face, and so I contrive this feeling you're going to kill me, so I pull out a gun. It has to be a good faith basis that you are going to assault me. So you spit in my face, and it's followed up by something else. But California has two very distinct laws regarding self-defense. Again, one is death, causing great bodily injury or death, and one is not causing great bodily injury or death.
So going to the international stage, so what Stewart was predicating this on or beginning this discussion with was a definition of proportionality that's found in Additional Protocol 1, which is an additional protocol to the Geneva Conventions. So Geneva Conventions go back to 1864, but they have a more ancient lineage of that. And what this body of law governs is the conduct of hostilities on the battlefield. So there is a proportionality element that I already described regarding the UN Charter and resort to the use of force in self-defense under Article 51. That's a very different proportionality test than once war is actually started, there are different rules that apply. The United States calls them the law of war, calls them armed conflict. Most of the rest of the world, including Israel, call them international humanitarian law. international humanitarian law I use all the time because I have to in my scholarship, but it's not that humanitarian because it allows for a damn great deal of death and killing and destruction. So once there's an armed conflict, and there's a distinction between international armed conflicts between states, which you have a huge amount of law that applies, then you have an armed conflict between a state, like Israel, against a non-state armed group, like Hamas, like Hezbollah, like Palestinian Jihad, etc. So, but today, most of the rules regarding targeting, regarding who, and definitely who you can kill, they've merged. They're the same, whether it's an international armed conflict between Russia and Ukraine versus what's going on between Israel and Hamas right now. And the fundamental rule, you can call it a principle, you can call it a rule, the law is called a principle, is distinction. That is, that a military, and everyone's obligated to follow the laws of war, but of course these non-state armed groups are not. But individuals can kill other individuals as long as they are not civilians. There's a bifurcation of the battlefield between civilians and fighters, belligerents, combatants. There's different legal terms of art for all of that, but I'm just going to lump them all under the fighters, the belligerents. You can kill belligerents, but you don't kill civilians. You can target and destroy military targets, weapons, weapon depots, even roads that are contributing, making a strategic contribution to the fight. There's actually a more precise definition, but you don't get to kill the civilians. So the rule of proportionality comes in, and it's older than its articulation, Article 1, Additional Protocol 1, it's in Article 51. It's also found in Article 57 under feasible precautions. But it says, look, it's nothing to do with, well, if I go after this target and it's only a tank, I better not drop a 2,000-pound bomb on it because that's not proportional. No. Proportionality only comes in regarding the laws of war when there are civilians or civilian property present. And those civilians or that civilian property is going to be harmed when distinction's already been followed and the military has a military target, a military objective that it's going to target. But when it goes after that military objective, such as a Hamas command center that's deep underground under an apartment building in a refugee camp, to use a very real example, I don't think Israel was going after just one Hamas fighter. They're going after a command node of Hamas leadership. And Hamas leadership was violating its own law of war obligations to distinguish itself from the civilians. Instead, it intentionally places itself under civilians to use them as shields. But just because Hamas is violating its obligations of the law of war doesn't mean Israel can do the same. Just like with the United States, because we are not them, and we live by values and we live by law. And so proportionality would say that once you have a legitimate military target, which belligerents always are unless they're surrendered and they're in your custody, or they're already ordered to combat, like dying in the hospital. So you've got a legitimate military target, a command and control center. You know that there are civilians around, that there's civilian property. So a commander has to do this incredibly difficult balancing test that we already heard. That's incredibly difficult, if not sometimes impossible, but the law requires it, to say, look, what is my concrete and direct military advantage that I will gain, that I anticipate in gaining from striking this target, neutralizing it, destroying it? And it can be, and this is where it gets a little in the gray area, it can be that direct and concrete military advantage that's anticipated from neutralizing that military objective can be infused by your overall campaign, right? And so, but in the eyes of the commander, the targeteer, the decision maker, in knowing what they know at the time, that advantage, right? Then they compare it to how many civilians are going to die with this strike. I know I'm going to kill 50, for example, and I'm going to destroy an entire apartment building. Is that incidental damage? Because the law actually uses the phrase incidental. We often use collateral. Is that incidental civilian destruction, death and destruction? Is it excessive? Not just is it proportional a little bit more, is it excessive compared to the anticipated direct and concrete military advantage anticipated? That is a really, really tough call. And we cannot tell whether or not that rule is followed by looking at the effects after a strike, because we have no idea what the anticipated military advantage was. We don't know if they knew how many civilians were there, because they don't have to be right. They just have to take all feasible precautions. So this rule of proportionality is actually found in a larger rule called feasible precautions. And this is where really the money is made in reducing and limiting civilian casualties. There's a absolute rule that constant care must be taken to mitigate the effects of war on civilians and civilian property. Absolute. And so, but what is this constant care? It's things like warnings to tell civilians, leave northern Gaza and go to the south. Warnings are not absolutely required, though. It's only when they're feasible. And who gets to decide feasibility? The reasonable military commander making that decision based on all the information that they have and that they should have had. What should they have had? Whatever another reasonable military commander would have said they should have been using at the time. And so these feasible precautions, such as did you weigh the number of, did you look at the type of weapons you were employing here to ensure you're using the weapon that will cause the least amount of civilian damage? So there's a weaponeering analysis. There is a warnings analysis. Is it feasible for us to give these warnings, or are we going to lose our surprise, our strategic advantage here? So there's these preparatory steps that precede getting to the proportionality analysis. And again, if you're just firing on Hamas, let's say they have a military frigate out in the Mediterranean and there's no civilians on board, drop a 2,000-pound bomb on it. Because there are no civilians around, there's no proportionality analysis made. There is a war crime of disproportionate attack under the International Criminal Court, and we can argue about their jurisdiction all day long. But when courts have tried to apply disproportionate attack and actually have folks convicted for it, it's incredibly, incredibly hard. What the law does absolutely prohibit is no direct attacks against civilians. You don't get to intentionally target the civilians. That's clear as day. So that's a little bit about what goes on into the very difficult proportionality analysis. One vignette. When I got to headquarters U.S. Central Command as a major in the United States Air Force, I was the only Air Force officer in the legal staff at that time. We were fighting in both Iraq and Afghanistan. At the time, my boss was General Abizaid, and then I rotated through many. I had a 2-year tour, but the generals kept extending me. I wound up spending 4 years there, which in dog years was about 28. And I was the chief of international law, and I advised General Petraeus, who was one of my bosses at the time. And when I first got there, and I think this has been declassified since, our rules of engagement, which is how commanders translate all these fancy Geneva Conventions laws and the rules of war into concrete direction and guidance for their troops on the ground, are called rules of engagement. Lawyers don't write them, commanders write them, but lawyers strongly advise their commanders because they have to ensure they comply with the law of war. So there was actually regarding operations in Iraq. Mind you, this was June of 2006. We had shock and awe campaign of March of 2003. So we've been there for a while. The Shia insurgency is already, the Sunni insurgency and Shia insurgency has already started. So I looked at our rules of engagement, and it was for every member of a hostile group, because there are all sorts of non-state armed groups running around, 30 civilians. It was 1 to 30. And I remember going, oh my God, in this day and age, we're going to have 1 to 30? But you can see how incredibly difficult it is to actually put numbers on these things. And I did hear a scholar on NPR the other day. This was an interesting way to put it, and I've heard this put before, but he said, look, the proportionality analysis has to be the civilians are civilians are civilians. If you're going to drop a bomb in that apartment building to go after Hamas command and control node, and you know you're going to the estimate is, whatever the number of dead civilians, would you do it if those civilians had all been Israeli? Because life is the same. And I think that goes back to one of your points. Civilians are civilians regardless of the nationality under the law.
Thank you. In going a little beyond just the civilian lives, I want to move a little bit to civilian infrastructure, because that is also talked about, especially under humanitarian issues. What infrastructure that helps to support civilians, how is that dealt with? So in the first Persian Gulf War back in 1991, coalition forces mounted strikes against Iraq's power infrastructure, their electric grid. And they pretty much destroyed the entire grid throughout the entire country. And when questioned about it, you left all these people in the dark without energy, without electricity to live. Is that a war crime? And the Department of Defense gave the following statement. Electricity is vital to the functioning of a modern military and industrial power such as Iraq, and disrupting the electrical supply can make destruction of other facilities unnecessary. Disrupting electricity supply to key Iraqi facilities degraded a wide variety of crucial capabilities, from the radar sites that warned of coalition airstrikes to the refrigeration used to preserve biological weapons to nuclear weapons production facilities. To do this effectively required the disruption of virtually the entire Iraqi electric grid to prevent the rerouting of power around damaged nodes. According to the DoD, the dual-use nature of the electric grid justified the attacks despite the impact on the civilian population. I know in our materials there are some very ancient quotes, one involving Islamic law and one involving Jewish law, Rabbi, about when you go into another territory, there are certain things you're not supposed to destroy. And we are supposed to protect certain property, even in the act of self-defense. Can you talk about that?
So, a little bit about war, just to go back a little bit. We spoke before about the concept of rodif, the pursuer. When someone's actively threatening you on a personal state, then you can attack them. If they're not actively threatening you, and exactly when that point is, maybe we could talk at a different point, but then you cannot. If they're not actively threatening, you cannot attack them. When it comes to war, though, there's a whole different set of rules, and it works like that in our current laws as well. It doesn't work the same way. It works kind of in our day-to-day life. So here in Judaism also, once you're in a state of war, any combatant automatically becomes a legitimate target. And anything that poses any threat for you already becomes a legitimate target, and you don't have to wait for them to threaten you, because a soldier's first duty is to their mission to protect, for whatever the goal of their battle is, and to protect themselves and the people around them. However, when civilians are caught in war, and when others are caught in war, the Torah does put some limitations on it. The Torah does mention, and we have it in our books, I think it's on page 3, the Torah does mention not cutting down fruit trees. And I think there's an Islamic quote that mentions the same thing. That is, again, only if one can make war without doing it. It depends on its need. But what the Torah doesn't mention explicitly, but alludes to, and is quoted in later sources, in the Talmud and later in Maimonides, is that when you besiege a city, you have to leave one side open. And what we mean is, not that you leave one side open for more weapons and fighters to get in, but you need to allow people to leave. And so what happened historically in war, the Ramban Nachmanides explains this in his commentary on Sefer HaMitzvot, on the Book of Mitzvot, that what happened historically in war is when you would besiege a city, the way you would attack a city, you would besiege a city, and you would not let anyone in so they cannot get any more materials, anything that will help them, but you also want them to lose their even basic food, basic necessities, and you also don't let people out, because the more people that are in there, the more higher their consumption, and the faster they'll consume their food, their water, and whatever else they have. So historical sieges, Roman sieges, there was no going in, but also no going out. The Torah, though, warns us, and this is again alluded to in the Torah itself, but in our oral tradition, that you must allow civilians out. You cannot stop people. Anyone who wishes to leave has that right to leave. You cannot stop people from leaving. You cannot stop people from escaping. You cannot take advantage of the civilians being there and use them as a strategic part of your battle. However, that is that's only harming the civilians directly. When it comes to proportionality, which we just spoke about, and so, again, Jews have not fought laws with Jewish law for a very long time. Today we have other systems of law as well, but we're still informed by our Jewish law. And so when it comes to impacting civilians that are perhaps impacted, and this would happen also in personal self-defense, where you're going to defend yourself against an attacker. But that attacker has their own shield, human shield. They're holding someone as a human shield. The rule is that if your life is threatened, you can do anything to defend yourself. So while our current Geneva Convention rules require proportionality, under our Jewish values, our requirement to defend ourselves is preeminent. That is what's most important, the defense of ourselves. We're not allowed to attack civilians. We must allow civilians to escape. We must protect civilians as much as feasible, but if necessary to achieve our objectives, to ultimately defend ourselves. Judaism did not historically see a problem with necessarily collateral, hitting civilians in collateral damage as well, or any limit to it. And for that matter, if the only way that, while we do have to take steps to try to protect civilian infrastructure, if the only way we can achieve our objectives and defend ourselves properly is by attacking those, not attacking civilians directly, but harming them as a result, we have the right to do so under our Jewish values. And I know that doesn't run in with international law, and then you run into the question, well, we're also obliged by international law.
But can I ask a question? Because I think it's closer to international law than may appear at first blush, because of the word necessary. Right? You said necessary. So the law under IHL, law of war, the additional protocol, the Geneva Convention says that the reasonably foreseeable deaths, civilian deaths, cannot be clearly excessive to the anticipated military advantage gained. And so, to me, that means it wasn't necessary to kill those civilians. So, I mean, perhaps it's a little bit closer there with if we put it on, what does necessity mean in the Talmud or the Torah?
I don't know if we have good definitions for all of these. As I said, this law hasn't been practiced, so we don't really have case law for much of this. A lot of it's theoretical. We have the original laws, and then people discussing, scholars even up to recent times discussing the theory, kind of what we should do theoretically, what our Jewish values should be. So I don't know if we have a clear definition. But that said, I don't know if we would look at any proportionality. In other words, the example given in the Talmud in a somewhat different case is if, and this is with the value of saving an individual life. The Talmud gives an example. It says that if there's someone whom the city is surrounded and they say, hand over this innocent individual, we want to kill him. And we'll spare the city, otherwise we attack the city. The city's forbidden from handing over this individual because, as I mentioned earlier, one life is infinite, 1,000 lives are infinite, 1,000,000 lives are infinite. One life has no less value than 1,000,000 lives from our perspective. So the number of lives is not what we look at. And so we would say we'd have to defend ourselves, but attack the city if necessary. We cannot hand over this individual. So it's a very different scenario, very different context. But to then translate it over to our current, where one life and 1,000 lives don't matter. Lives matter infinitely. I misspoke. One life and 1,000 lives are of equal value, of equal infinite value. And so when we're in a campaign where we're in a war state, where we need to defend ourselves, and therefore we're able to take life as necessary for our defense, however many lives needed to take, we would have to take. We wouldn't aim at the civilians, because even if that would gain, we'd get some strategic value from it, we would be forbidden from doing so. We'd be forbidden from holding the civilians hostage, even if it would give us some strategic value, because we could only aim at at fighters. But even so, if others would be harmed as a result, the numbers it's not a numbers game, at least from our perspective.
And I think that's the better way, honestly, to think of proportionality under IHL, because numbers don't get you anywhere. It's so contextual less. If it is necessary to kill all the civilians in the building to achieve your direct and concrete military advantage that is absolutely necessary, then that's going to meet proportionality, regardless of the numbers. But the real rub is what is necessary. What is absolutely necessary? What is the definition of concrete direct military advantage? How much can that be linked back to the overall campaign? What are reverberating effects? Like, what if you knock out that electrical grid, which is a lawful military objective, if it's being used both to provide electricity for civilian homes as well as for a military base, military planes, etc. That's why it was called dual use in that snippet that you read. What if that means that after you stop that electricity, 20 days, a month later, there's going to be these effects on civilians? How far out do we actually have to count those? So it starts to get really complicated really quickly, way more complicated than the 5-second, 10-second, even 30-second soundbite that the American public and the international public are actually getting on the news. And to me, that's really dangerous, because this is something I think struck me with what you said, Rabbi, which is the Jewish law reflects not just law but values. The law of armed conflict was developed, the modern law of armed conflict was developed to provide a balance between military necessity on one hand and humanity on the other. And we ask our young men and women in uniform here and in Israel and other countries that try to follow the law of war to put themselves in harm's way and to take lives. It's incredibly difficult for human beings who are not psychopaths to actually take other human life. So we ask them and order our soldiers and sailors and Marines and Space Guardians and airmen and airwomen to go and take life. And we say, but you can come home and look yourself in the mirror. You can look your husband in the mirror when you come home, or your wife, or your partner, and know that you have a clear conscience because you followed the law. So if we start just disregarding, just saying, well, if you criticize militaries who are trying to follow the law, then at some point they're not going to follow it at all, right? Because if you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. But the battlefield without the law of armed conflict, I believe, is worse than the battlefield with the law of armed conflict, as awful and tragic as it is and always is in urban conflict. This is just my pitch for we have to do what we can to understand what the law actually requires, because if it's being wrongly applied and vilified in individuals as well as entire military can't commit a war crime, but if they're accused of war crimes, what is that doing to the law that applies to everybody else? And I think we're doing our folks in military in the uniform a grave disservice.
Thank you. I wanted to pick up on something Rabbi Zalman said about allowing an escape route.
That's right.
About allowing an escape route. And Jack, I want to turn this question to you in the context of personal self-defense. Just a couple weeks ago, 9:30 at night in the Hollywood Hills, a woman was confronted. This actually happened on October 15th. There was some pounding at her back door. She went to her back door, and there was a person there who said he was hurt and he needed help. Let me in, let me in, let me in, let me in. And she said, go away, and he wouldn't go away. And she shot him. She said he reached into his pocket, and she shot him. I also, at the same time, think of a scenario where perhaps the person was in the house, but in the kitchen, maybe even going through a refrigerator or something, but you've got a family, you've got kids in the house, the mom's home alone, and you catch someone rummaging through your kitchen. At what point, before we exercise, let's say, deadly self-defense, or potentially deadly self-defense, must we give the perpetrator an opportunity to escape? In the old days, the police used to yell, "Stop or I'll shoot," which is quite quaint these days because they're not allowed to shoot anybody. But you can't shoot a fleeing felon. That used to be a thing. What type of warnings, if any, does one need to give prior to exercising self-defense?
So California doesn't have an escape law. You don't have to let them escape, but it does have a defense of property law. This is where I would agree proportionality is actually the right word. You can use that amount of reasonable force, which I would say is proportionality depending on the property, the value of the property, maybe the sentimentality of the property. Is it your car? Is it your TV? Are they just taking food from your refrigerator? So I think in this standard there is a proportionality rule about what kind of force you can use that person who's broken into your home, because we see it all the time. People break into homes and they're just literally cooking a meal. Does that person have a right to shoot? No, but the law gives them the right to force that person out. And they use that amount of reasonable force, again, proportionality, to get that person out of their house. And that proportionality, that reasonableness, again, is going to depend upon a lot of subjective factors. What that person looks like, what that person, whether they were armed, what your experiences. Was I recently the victim of residential burglary? My feelings are going to be different than somebody who's never been the victim of a residential burglary. But I am entitled to try to force that person out of my house. I'm entitled to use force to get that person out of my house. And I'm entitled to use, again, proportionality, a reasonable amount of force to get that person out of my house. And if then that escalates to where I feel I'm going to suffer great bodily injury or death, I can escalate it further. But that's because that person has already escalated. I can't just escalate it because I choose to. And so, but there is no right of escape. I don't have to stand by and let that person escape. I don't have to go call the police. I'm entitled in California to force that person out and to defend my property.
Jack, can you help me? Because I teach a general common law, criminal law course, not California specific, but because it's the bar. I use a lot of California examples, but in the general common law, many states across the United States have something called, it's different than just defensive property, because the typical rule is you can never use deadly force only in defensive property. But then there's this defense called defensive habitation. And there's the elements, or if the person has a reasonable belief that someone is coming into their home, or actually in their home, to perpetrate a serious felony, serious usually meaning violent, they can use deadly force. And especially if it's reasonable to believe that non-deadly force would put themselves or someone else in the home at risk. An example I would give is, a young mom's home alone with her kids, her husband's working the night shift, she hears a window break, she picks up a baseball bat, starts to walk down the stairs, and there's a man that she doesn't know, she can't see his face, walking up the stairs. She bashes him in the head with a baseball bat, deadly force, right? Under a general defensive habitation defense, that would typically be considered lawful in many states around the U.S. Do we have something like that?
No. So California doesn't have a defensive habitation. I think actually Texas, if I remember right, did, because I can remember incidences where somebody was trying to break into a home, not even gotten into the home, coming, knocking on the door, and the resident is allowed to defend their home. California doesn't have that kind of law, but what is reasonable is if somebody's breaking into your home, good luck finding 12 jurors who aren't going to believe that you had a reasonable fear that your life was in danger, that you were going to suffer great bodily injury or death, that this person broke into your home. I can't imagine one person here who has a strange person break into their home who doesn't have a reasonable fear, especially if you have children, that person isn't going to cause you great bodily injury or death. And that then elevates it to the point that you can use self-defense to defend yourself.
It's pure self-defense.
It's
not
pure
defensive
self-defense.
habitation.
Yeah.
Do you have to warn them? You have to
No.
say, get out of my house. You have to say, I've got a gun, I'm going to shoot you.
I think that's a natural instinct, but the law doesn't require that. The law doesn't require that I warn you and say, I need you to get out. Where the law allows me to use force to get you out of the house, presumably I would say, get out of my house, right? But if you've broken into my house, and you may have a knife or a weapon, you presumably have some sort of device that's allowed you to break into my house, which you could use as a weapon. I have every reason to believe that you're going to cause me great bodily injury or death, and it just transforms into self-defense. I do not have to warn you. I don't have to wait till you walk down the hall into my children's bedroom before I shoot you.
All right. So personally, there's no warning. Rachel knows what I want to ask next. So Rabbi, I'll let you go in and Rachel can think about it for a second.
So just to add to that, Rachel just mentioned the common law. I don't know what the common law's source is, but the Torah is actually very explicit about this. While generally the Torah allows for as I mentioned earlier, to take action against a roadways, a pursuer, someone who's actively threatening you. But there must be some level of threat or some reasonable reason to believe that your life is really in danger or someone else's life is really in danger. However, the Torah does take exception very clearly when someone breaks into your home. While the assumption, if you meet a regular person walking down the street that maybe looks you the wrong way, but you don't have any other reason to believe that your life is in danger, you cannot treat them as an aggressor. You cannot treat them as a road thief. You cannot assume that they're going to kill you. However, if someone breaks into your home, if someone is in your home, or attempting to break into your home, the Torah says very clearly, unless you know explicitly that they are not intending to kill you, such as it's your parent, is the example the Torah gives, but that our sages give. But otherwise, unless you think that they're certainly not going to kill you, you can assume they're going to kill you, and you are expected to use deadly force to protect yourself. And I think that which is explicit in the Torah has probably made its way through Christianity and through into common law.
So that's a 3,000-year-old law that Jack was talking about. So on the question of warnings, back in on May 15th, 2021, Israeli Defense Forces provided a 1-hour notice to evacuate the Al Jalala Tower. It's a Gaza City building housing various media outlets, including Al Jazeera and the Associated Press. The IDF claimed that the building also housed Hamas terrorist infrastructure. And prior to the bombing, they phoned the owner of the building, they dropped leaflets, they used what they call knock-knock bombs, which are basically really loud things to get people's attention. They used reverse cell phone technology. They used all sorts of things to warn. And yet still, people may not leave when warned, and civilian casualties occur. Rachel, what is the duty in these international conflicts when you have a necessary military objective? What's the duty to warn?
So the duty to warn isn't new, even though its current form is found under Article 57, again, of the Additional Protocol 1, which neither, again, the U.S. nor Israel is a party to, but it's considered customary international law. But this duty to warn when there are civilians present, because this is about saving civilians. You're not going to call, if you're about to attack that military base and it's all military, you're not warning anybody and there's no duty to warn. But again, it's about trying to reduce suffering in war of innocents caught up in war. And so this goes back to a famous code called the Lieber Code. The country that had the very first code, that is regulations governing the law of war, providing laws of war, was the United States. These were commissioned by President Lincoln during the Civil War, written by a Prussian American, Francis Lieber, who had actually fought on the battlefields in Europe and became a law professor, so I like him. So I try to follow his footsteps, but I haven't written any code lately. But there was a warning, an obligation to warn a town or any area in which civilians may be harmed by the ensuing attack. So, but the way it's formulated today, and has been for years, is that an effective warning must be given if feasible. If feasible. So it does not mean required. If feasible. So let's go take it part by part. So this is, again, it's part of the constant care obligation, the obligation to take constant care to mitigate the effects of battle on civilians. And so the first part is effective warning. Effective does not mean successful. So effective means the civilians can hear you. But unfortunately, when Hamas, which they've been doing for years, tells the civilians, don't listen to that, they're just kidding. That's why Israel then continued to resort to greater and greater types of warnings, such as the roof knocking technique, which of course then got lambasted by human rights groups because, oh my God, you're dropping a bomb on the house and that could hurt it. Well, the big bomb that's about to follow, it's going to hurt it too. It was trying to scare people out of their homes because they were refusing to listen to the warnings. And in those situations, it was feasible to do so. But just because Israel used reverse calls, the roof knocking technique doesn't make it feasible in every scenario. But they were trying to limit civilian casualties under their legal obligation to take constant care, and because of the strategic delegitimizing effect of dead kids on TV, which is what Hamas is trying to show the world. They want those civilians to be killed. And so the warnings are only required when the civilians are present if it's feasible to do so. And what's that? And it comes down to a rule of reason. What's reasonable for that military commander in that circumstance to believe? If they're going after a command and control node underneath an apartment building, and if they give warnings, all the Hamas leaders are going to leave and scurry, then they don't have to give it because it's not feasible. They do have to if civilians stay, they still have to engage in the proportionality analysis. They can't just level the building if warnings aren't heeded. There are a few situations in which warnings are expressly required. And that would be hospitals. Medical transports, medical facilities have received special protection in the law of war going back to, at least the first Geneva Convention in 1864, again, the Hague Regulations, and all these movements toward trying to codify the law of war. But a military hospital is always off limits, except if the enemy's using it for military purposes. Then it's not off limits anymore. But the attacking party is required to give a warning. Stop using it as a weapons depot. Stop using it to shoot at us from, and stop getting your rocket launchers off the top of the hospital. That's when a warning actually is required. They don't work because there's a reason that the enemy is using these civilian structures and hospitals, etc., as targets. So was that
It is, and it brings us to our last scenario of the evening, and it's an emotional one. But it does have to do with combatants, let's say, not playing fair and not abiding by the humanitarian rules, laws, ethics, values. And I'll give you an example from history first, but it's very relevant today. In the spring of 1995, there was a war going on in the Balkans. Bosnian Serb military personnel seized 284 UN peacekeepers. And they held those peacekeepers at ammunition bunkers, radar and communication centers, and other potential NATO air targets in order to keep NATO, and essentially the U.S. Air Force, from bombing those targets and injuring or killing the UN peacekeepers who were held there. Today, right now, there are a number of people who are being held hostage for use of human shields in Israel. And without really asking a question, I'm sorry, Gus. Can each of you, starting with Rabbi Zalman, speak to what our values and laws and rules teach us as to how one is supposed to be a humanitarian maker of war when such situations present themselves?
So in the 1200s in Germany, the leader of probably the kind of greatest Jewish scholar, rabbi of his day, was the mayor of Rothenburg, known as the Maharami Rothenburg, Rothenburg being in Germany. And at the time, Germany was a bunch of different states, pretty anti-Semitic. One of the kings I forget offhand which state it was, had this Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg arrested, kind of the most famous, renowned Jewish leader of his day, had him arrested and accused him of who knows what, and then demanded a very, very large sum of money, huge sum of money, for his release. And the Jewish community, their leading rabbi is arrested. They were not very wealthy at the time because of all the anti-Jewish laws at the time. It made it hard for Jews to survive, to thrive, to do business. And yet they managed to scrape together this huge sum of money in order to free him. And they were going to free him, And then they got a message from Reb Meir of Rothenburg himself, the Maharam, who was in prison. Please don't free me. I don't want you to free me. Why? The Talmud says that if back in the days when there were pirates and people were taken captive and then sold on slave markets, it was a very common thing till fairly recently in the Mediterranean, and people's ships were pirated, and so the Jewish community has an obligation, what we call in Hebrew pidyon shvuim, to redeem captives. And every Jewish community in Tunisia and Morocco and these places where it was very common, where they had these slave markets, all the way through to the 19th century, they all had funds and had people whose job it was to go every day to the slave market, find fellow Jews that had been taken by the pirates and free them. There's a rule in the Talmud, this has been going back for thousands of years. There's a rule, though, in the Talmud that if they're asking for the Jewish slave, the Jewish captured individual, more than the standard market value that they would get in these slave markets, then you're not allowed to free them. If they think the Jewish community is going to pay more because they're Jewish, you're not allowed to pay for it. And so Reb Meir of Rothenburg said, they're asking more than would be reasonable, and so therefore do not free me, because freeing me will only lead to other rabbis getting arrested and being taken hostage and just trying more of the same. If they could do so well with one, they're just going to do more. And so this is a Jewish law that freeing people that are captives has been a very important part of Judaism and very practical in a lot of places where it really where Jews were taken captive, and Americans were taken captive in the 19th century on the Barbary Coast. So it was very common. We were always careful never to free people for more than their value. And this goes into the hostage negotiations question, which is not your question, a separate question. But to get back to the question, though, the same thing also happens when hostages are taken and used as human shields. And here, and this could be difficult, I think, in all of these things, in all the questions of defense and laws of war and values, where we have to, as difficult as it is and heart-wrenching as it is, to differentiate our feelings from our values which are the kind of the right thing to do. And so here, if we allow that every time someone takes a hostage and then stands behind them, then that allows them to save themselves, then that is encouraging hostage-taking. That's going to encourage more hostages. And so our Jewish value, as hard as it is to say, and I don't know if I could actually do it, bring myself to do it, but our Jewish value would then tell us that we should never use the fact that hostages are there as a reason not to attack the people who are threatening us, because that will only encourage more hostage-taking. And so, while it's difficult, because that means that then we are doing something that may actively kill a hostage, and can you actually pull the trigger if you know your parents, your children are there? I don't know if people would actually do it, but at least from an intellectual level. And it takes that fortitude from Mayor of Rothenburg, who spent the rest of his life in prison and refused to be redeemed, refused to be freed, and he was in prison for the rest of his life. Most of us probably couldn't do it, and it's hard. It's easy to stand here and say it, but I think it's still good that we know the value and understand that what they're trying to do with hostage-taking, anyone who takes hostages, whatever they're trying to do, we need to counter their intent. And their intent is to use hostages to protect themselves. We have to make sure hostages do not protect them.
So, Jack, just to give you more of a personal self-defense example.
It's not really something I deal with.
Is there any situation that you can imagine where a perpetrator might be allowed to take someone as a human shield or a human hostage to protect themselves from what they may perceive as an imminent threat to their personal bodily harm?
On a personal note, no. I've had clients do it with police officers under the pretext that they believe officers were going to harm them, shoot them, kill them, and therefore shoot at officers. to try to kill officers with the idea that they're just protecting themselves. But maybe I can put it in a different way. We're talking about morality. For the most part, my clients are the captives. They are people in captivity for most of their lives. Most of my clients spend most of their lives, from childhood to the end of their life, in captivity. I grew up believing human life was worth something, that all human life was redeemable. And I've seen clients do the worst things, the most unimaginable things. And I know we watch the news. I've seen clients do things that would shock you. And I still refuse to believe they're not redeemable. I refuse to believe that they're not someone I can help. And they're the captive for me. They're people I try to assist, to work within the system that I'm given, to do what I can to assist them. Sometimes they appreciate it, sometimes they don't. But I don't believe in the death penalty. I don't believe in life sentences, because I believe, regardless of what the crime was, that they're somewhere deep down they're redeemable, that we can help them, fix them if given the opportunity. And I would tell you, so if we're talking about captives, in my opinion, my clients are oftentimes the captives. Maybe captives for the crimes they committed, and maybe things they need to be punished for. But we could argue all day about proportionality with regards to what they're being punished for. And so that's how I would phrase that answer.
Thank you. Rachel, I assume you don't need me to ask a further question.
But unlike international humanitarian law of war, which strictly prohibits revenge, right? You're not allowed to act in revenge. I think much of our criminal law in the United States is vengeful, is very vengeful. And, one of the purposes of punishment, besides deterrence and rehabilitation, which is never resourced, and incapacitation for safety, is retribution, which is often and very vengeful. And that is not supposed to be translating to the law that I'm talking about here, but it does, and it has, and it will continue, because I think it's a natural human emotion, and the law can't always constrain that. But very much like what Jewish law says, I can see it reverberating into today's law of armed conflict, is that a human shield doesn't stop anything, but there is a requirement to go through that constant care to mitigate civilian casualties. And if there's a civilian that will be killed by going after that legitimate military objective, you have to go through a proportionality analysis. And again, there's a difference between policy reasons and reasons for strategic legitimacy and what the law allows. The law allows for a lot. But the law, it can be lawful, but it can be awful. It can be lawful, but it can be awful. But I do believe that the same tenor of if you reward terrorist organizations that try to distort and pervert and use the law of war to their advantage, and you let them get away with it, they will continue to do that, and that'll be the elimination of not only your state, but of the law itself.
All right. Before we completely conclude, I'd like to open it up to questions of our esteemed panelists, if there are. I'll say one question I know was asked of me earlier, and I'll relay it to the person who asked it. And that was the question of, I guess it's more towards Rachel, but just as a law in general. There was an earlier discussion that Hamas would trade the hostages for 6,000 prisoners. And the question was asked to me, well, why don't you just do that deal? Trade them, and then once you get the hostages out, just go back and kill everybody.
Hostage negotiation and trades, with the IDF soldier Khalid Shalit, I'm mispronouncing his name probably, several years ago, he was held in captivity in Gaza for years, and Israel did release hundreds of Palestinian terrorists from their jails and to get him back. They got him back, but it didn't do anything to mitigate the threat. But I think that's a policy issue. That's not a legal issue. Israel could do that if they wanted to. But again, to what end? But they can't just go back and then say, well, let's kill them all. Well, who do you mean by kill them all? And I do want to pose the question, because I think it's a very legitimate one. It's not a legal one. It's an actual, operational one. Can Hamas be eliminated? Can Hamas be eliminated? And you've seen the videos that the young children in Gaza are raised on. They're indoctrinated and trained and educated in their schools to hate Jews and to destroy Israel. So if we kill leadership now, but we're not going to kill the children, at least not as tragic, awful, incidental damage, lawfully allowed, but at some point, unless everyone was killed, which I would hope Israel would not want to do, and the world wouldn't want it to happen, can Hamas be eliminated? And if it can't, then we have to start looking at to what end is the destruction. But meanwhile. But I do want to say, I wanted to take this moment before I forget to thank my co-panelists, both of them, for educating me. And Jack, your courageous show of vulnerability earlier and sharing your family experiences.
My wife would tell you like
really
an open
touching.
book.
No, but thank you. That takes courage, and it was very moving and inspirational. So thank you.
All right. Fred.
My name is Fred Bobina. I'm an attorney in Stewart for a while. What was running through my mind when you were going through these different scenarios was whether, given the current international law, customary law, Geneva Convention, or otherwise, if a decision would have to be made by policymakers about an operation like Hiroshima and Nagasaki, would that be lawful today? Given the proportionality.
I've had this argument with my dearest friend who's taught me so much, and we've argued against each other on NPR. And PBS NewsHour asked me to come on last week to talk about the laws of war, and I'm like, but I didn't like them setting me up because I felt like they were setting me up to argue against him, and I agree with them on everything. He believes that it still would be lawful because there were military objectives, and it was, proportionality is really hard to put a thumb on. I don't think today that the folks would agree, now that we've had decades and decades and decades of tighter rules, the current Geneva Conventions and additional protocols, greater value placed on civilian life. And the biggest problem for me with Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the dropping of those atomic bombs was that it placed greater value on the death of U.S. troops than it did on the death of the civilians there. And that, to me, was an inaccurate calculation because military members, that's why they wear uniforms, and we thank them for their service, because they're targets, and they're willing targets. Not always. In Russia, they're conscripts, as well as in Ukraine, but they're the targets. And so you don't get to say one for one, I can kill, how many hundreds of thousands of Japanese died, so in order to save how many Americans we thought would take to take mainland Japan. I think today's law, that calculation would come out differently. But again, the law was different at that time. We had firebombing of Dresden, firebombing of Tokyo. More Japanese died, I think, in the firebombing of Tokyo than they did in Nagasaki. It was horrendous, and that's why we have the current legal construct that we have now. It's always in reaction to the last horrific catastrophe the world's experienced. So I don't think it's lawful today, but others disagree with me.
All right, I think with that we can wrap it up. Thank you. Give us some concluding remarks.
Sure. Well, thank you all for joining our South Bay Jewish Law Forum. As Stuart mentioned, we hope to do a lot more. I think my fellow panelists, Rachel and Jack, you both taught me so much and really, really enjoyed it. I'm sure we all did. But especially I want to thank Stuart, who really put this whole thing together, A to Z, beginning to end. I don't know how much law he's practiced in the last month or so, focused on this particular event. And this is not his first event. I think he's done a number of our events, or many of our events in the past, and so we really, really appreciate that. And we're looking forward to do many, many more events like these. different topics, different speakers. We've had a number of people who have kind of volunteered to be part of it, and we appreciate everybody who's stepped up, everyone who's helped us put these things on. But we definitely could use a lot more help, so Stuart doesn't have to do everything himself next time. And so anybody who appreciates, any of you who really appreciates this, please come over to me afterwards. I'd love, or to Stuart, and we'd love to get you more involved. We'd love for you to take on, help us put together more of these events. There are a lot of work behind the scenes to do. So if any of you would like to join or get involved in some way or another, please let us know. And we look forward to seeing you all. Tell your friends about it. Tell your coworkers and your colleagues about it. And we hope to see you all again very soon for another event.
Thank you all for coming.